Recently I bought this antique map of North America, published in 1823, which is 191 years ago now. If I said North America now, you might think of USA, Canada, Central America and the Caribbean. But actually back then it wasn't quite so simple. See, what you might think of as Canada now is actually divided up into quite a few different sections back in 1823. Upper and Lower Canada, referred to as the Canadas, were owned by the British. Further west, where you might think of as Ontario and Quebec today, was Rupert's Land, named after this German guy who had a bit of a penchant for red tarpaulins apparently. Rupert's Land was supposedly owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company is one of the oldest companies in the world, but they conveniently forgot at the time that there was a huge Aboriginal population in the area which had inhabited it for thousands of years and probably had a better claim than the Hudson's Bay Company did. Well, that's Canada, but what's about America? See, back then what you might consider to be the USA nowadays is very different. In 1823, the Star Spangled Banner had just 24 stars on it. It wasn't quite so spangly, and California, one of the largest states in the US today, was owned by Mexico. Mexico had only been created in 1821, 2 years previously. See, Mexico on this map is labelled as Mexico or New Spain, and New Spain was the Spanish colonial name for Mexico. North of the area labelled as California on this map is New Albion. Now this area was claimed by England, as Sir Francis Drake supposedly landed there when he circumnavigated the globe. The bay in which he landed is labelled on this map of B of Sir Fran Drake, or Bay of Sir Francis Drake. It's now known as Drake's Bay. Sir Francis Drake, for those of you who don't know, was a famous English explorer and navigator who in 1588 captained the English fleet against the Spanish Armada. When he found out that the Armada were invading the UK, he was famously caught out on Plymouth Hoe playing with bulls. The name Albion is supposed to have come from Alba for white, referring to the white cliffs in Drake's Bay, which are very similar to those found on the south coast of England. But that isn't the only cool place name on this map. Just off the eastern coast of Canada you can see an island labelled as C.S. Lewis Island. Now I can't find this island today, but it'd be great if you could get in touch if you know where it is. See, there's also other islands which have changed their names slightly over time, like Cuba Island and Vancouver's Island, which is now known as Vancouver Island. On the bottom of the map you can see that it's labelled as from the latest authorities. Now this kind of excuses the fact that some of the map is actually a bit of a mess, and other areas are missing altogether. I mean, just look at Alaska, or Alaska as it's called on this map, next to the Bering Strait, now known of course as the Bering Strait. Due to this lack of information, there's a lot of fragmentation up at the top of the map, and some areas are very sparsely labelled. In the northeast corner you can see something labelled as Coast seen by Lieutenant Egede in 1787. Further west there's something here. Sea seen by Mr. Hearn in 1771. And further west still. Sea seen by Mr. Mackenzie in 1789. Sorry about the accent. It wasn't quite known what was up there, and you can actually see that the coastline is kind of marked out with a dotted line in parts where they thought it might have led. But elsewhere on the map there are similarly cryptic labels. For instance, where you can now find Utah, there's one lake which is labelled as El Trimpanegos. Now I looked this up on the internet and it turns out that it's actually a typo. There was a Franciscan missionary who went through the area in 1776 and discovered this large body of water by accident, now known as Lake Utah. He named the lake after the local Native Americans, the Trimpanogotsis. By the time the illustrator of the map got around to labelling this, it was changed to El Trimpanogos. This lake wasn't even seen by another European until a year after this map was published, hence the label below the lake, doubtful. But that isn't the only area on this map which was doubtful. Below Vancouver Island is the supposed Strait of San Juan de Fuca, between the civilised Canada and the slightly less civilised USA to the south. And below the Lake Trimpanogos is Lake Sevier, which on this map is labelled the western limits of this lake are unknown. It was the particular age of this map which drew me to it, at a time when photography was rapidly developing. Get it? This illustration shows that the distinction between myths and reality was still somewhat blurred, and while in the east of America politicians were squabbling over the creation of new states, in the west there were huge areas which were still unexplored, and further north a vast white wilderness went on, seemingly forever.